Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dime's final webinar for this godforsaken year. Thank you for joining us. This is a very exciting one today. We haven't done too much content at Dime just yet with commercialization, and so this one is going to be particularly great, especially as we all gear up for kind of reassessing our strategies for 21 moving forward. Before we get started, I have to go through the next slide here, which will be our quick housekeeping notes. So if we could advance to that next slide. Do know that today's session is being recorded and that the slides and the recording will be made freely available on our website after today's session. And then the fun stuff about our webinar and most of our events here at Dime is the live interactive nature of the Q&A session. So if you're joining us today live, you have the unique ability to ask all of us questions. So please either raise your hand or type in the chat. And we would like to unmute you too to ask your question live, because that's when things are the most fun. And so if we go to our next slide here, we'll actually kick things off. So we have a really great panel today where we're talking about from concept to commercialization, about building evidence generation strategies for successful commercial success here. So we've got a panel that I'm very excited to talk with today. And so I'll let everyone introduce themselves, since you do a better job than I would, and we can kick it off with Shwaran.
Hi, well, thank you, Dime, and thank you, Jennifer, Rachel, for having me and well, all of us here. So lovely to meet everyone. My name's Shravan. By background, I'm a physician. I trained in the UK and practiced in London for a number of years, but I also have a good decade-odd experience building, selling companies, a lot of them focused in the digital health space. And at least for the last 5-odd years, that has been my sole and only focus, is working with digital health companies, building digital health companies and scaling them. Currently, now I am the founder and managing director of Strategy Health, which is a boutique strategy consulting firm that focuses on digital health, working mostly with providers and digital health firms to help with things like aligning evidence with commercial strategies and multiple other things that a lot of small firms tend to struggle with.
Awesome, thanks, Andrew.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Matskin. I'm a partner at Health Advances. Health Advances is a strategy consulting firm that focuses entirely on healthcare, obviously, and more specifically on commercial strategy and product development strategy across life sciences and digital health and health IT, which is the practice that I co-lead along with Jeff, and which I helped to found 7 or 8 years ago now. We work closely with leading digital health companies across lots of different digital health solution categories and technologies, as well as with life sciences companies, biopharma, medical device, and diagnostics, and large tech companies, and increasingly investors, on how to unlock the enormous potential of digital technologies across a very wide range of applications and settings in healthcare. I've been with the firm for a little bit over a decade, and prior to that, I was a consultant at Bain & Company.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Excited to have you here. All right, and Jeff, good friend of Dime and the mastermind behind today's session. Can you give our audience a bit of a background on you?
Yes, I am a big fan of Dime. I am a member of the SLB and have been for a couple of years. So thank you, Jen, Rachel, and Michelle. I don't know if she's on or not, but for all the help setting this up, very much appreciated. As Andrew said, I co-lead the digital health and health IT practice at Health Advances. Previously, I actually started my career off as a clinician, so working as a physical therapist, doing healthcare services and operations and management as well in that space, and then went on to do commercialization and market access consulting with a company called Bridgehead International, which got acquired by GFK, where I did market access, again, commercialization with medical device, diagnostics, and drugs. Then went on to industry to do market access, HEOR, evidence generation, evidence development for the medicines company, which has since been acquired by Novartis. And from there, I went on to be the Vice President of Market Access and Trade and Vice President of Commercial at Achille Interactive, a digital therapeutics company, where I did a lot of work on, obviously, evidence generation, which is what we're talking about today, commercialization, payer strategies, as well as product development.
All right, thank you, everyone. This is going to be a very great topic, and I don't know who else could be a better presenter on this topic. So thank you all for guiding us through today's session. All right, and let's go ahead and kick it off. Next slide, please.
Great. So I will kick things off. So I think it's always good to start off with some definitions. And if we move on to the next slide, maybe proceed one or two. I think most people here in the audience will probably be very familiar with this framework. This was put together by DIME, the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, and others. It is a great framework, and I think it has a huge amount of use. And I think we all use it when we think about where we fit digital health products within the general landscape. However, something that I've definitely seen, and I think that's happening more and more as people are coming across this and using this in the way in which they think about things, people forget that actually this is just a first start, and that it is a great start, but it is still just a first start. And a prime example would be the fact that definitions in general differ. The WHO has slightly different definitions. The FDA has slightly different definitions. Other regulatory bodies and societies have slightly different definitions on, how they see digital health, digital medicines, digital diagnostics, digital therapeutics all fitting together, and therefore the kinds of evidence that are required. One thing that you can see here is that when it talks about evidence, it talks about clinical evidence. And that's great. And I think it's important. We're healthcare firms and we should be super focused on clinical evidence. But one thing to keep in mind is that we're also, many of us, commercial entities. And so clinical evidence is not the only type of evidence that we should be keeping in mind. And that is one of the, I think, areas where using this framework to think about commercial strategies and evidence generation can slightly get people stuck. And so actually, I think a better way of thinking about evidence and aligning evidence with business models is to not really think about this, which is very super focused on clinical evidence, but to think more about the value propositions that the solutions and the technologies that you are putting together, or the technologies you're putting together to create solutions, are actually addressing. So if we move on to the next slide. And so I have to thank, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, right, okay. So I think in general, the value of digital health and the way to think about digital health when thinking about the different types of evidence that you can put together is in this general framework that digital health is anything that is acquiring, transforming, applying digital health data in some way or form. But ultimately, we are doing that to address value propositions, that we are driving value in some way or form. And those value propositions are numerous. So yes, it includes improving patient health outcomes, but it also improves the connection between healthcare providers and empowering patients to manage their care better and to shift reactive to preventive care, etc. And those have all the benefits that we know that digital health can create. And I think this way of thinking is a much more holistic method, and also helps you think through the different types of evidence that you can generate, which ultimately, Jeff and Andrew will talk about further on. So if we move on to the next slide. So this, I think, is the better way of thinking about things. That when you think about the value proposition for connecting patients to healthcare providers, the type of evidence that you're trying to show is that you have enabled effective care provision. And if you're empowering patients and that is your value proposition, then your evidence should show that you have empowered self-management and you design your trial or your study to show that you have empowered. If you're shifting from reactive to preventive care, then you have showed that you've increased preventive care use, that you have automated and scaled repetitive tasks, that you have improved patient experience, and that you have increased clinical outcomes. And when we think about the previous framework, we often focus on that last point, increasing clinical outcomes. And I think people also get a little confused between the difference between a study and a trial. Trials are incredibly useful and are necessary when we think about clinical outcomes, and especially when you think about ultimate regulatory approval and clearance and actually going down that pathway. but not everyone needs to pursue regulatory approval. And so trials aren't necessary for showing evidence in the other areas. But actually you can perform studies and you can perform A/B tests and you can make small iterations to generate evidence that ultimately when you go to your potential customer, you can show that you have enabled things, that you can show that you've empowered patients, you can show that you've increased use, you can show that you've improved patient experience. And that's, I think, the way to really think about evidence and align it to the customers and the business models that you ultimately will be pursuing. So I think Rachel is going to put a poll. I just had an interest in seeing what the audience thought between these two different scenarios. So the first question is thinking about what has more value. So if you're a company that can gather real world evidence from thousands of patients and show that you create value through that method, or you perform a trial as opposed to a study with 60 participants, it still has good power. However, it's done in a far more controlled environment. And then the second question is around patient engagement. So having very high patient engagement for a short period of time or having average engagement for a much longer period of time. So I'll give a few minutes for people to vote.
I'm disappointed the panelists can't vote, but other than that.
So how are we doing, Rachel?
I have seemed to have lost my Zoom window.
Well,
so I am
the votes are
scrambling to find it. Great. So let me see here. Does this? Okay. So let me hit this here.
There we go.
Awesome.
So interesting, particularly with the first one, which I think I was hoping for a vaguely even split, which is roughly what we've seen. And it's interesting that actually the people here listening today feel that real world evidence has huge value. And I think that's actually a really important point. And I think for early founders and early companies, that the idea of the gold standard being the randomized control trial, I think should be there, but we shouldn't put quite so much weight on randomized control trials. That actually, when you're able to reach out to thousands of patients and get good clinical data from those interactions, that has incredible power and ultimately can help you when going to customers and trying to get them to take on your tool. With the 90% engagement over 30 days or 50% engagement over 6 months. So this is actually taken from a client that I had who had been incredibly focused on the long-term engagement. But interestingly, one of the things that I noticed in the way in which their product worked was they had by far and away the best outcomes within the first 2 or 3 weeks. And thereafterwards, their outcomes plateaued. And even as patients dropped off their use, the patients continued to show longer term outcomes beyond the 4 or 5 month mark. And so those first 2 weeks were actually the most important period. But the company had set themselves up to maintain long-term engagement. And so one of the things that I worked with this company to do was to reconfigure the way in which they were working their program to maintain that engagement as high as possible for the first 3 weeks, and then compare it to their old data and see what happened. And their data, both on outcomes and on their economic data, was just as good, actually a little bit better on some of their metrics, with the 90% engagement for a short period of time compared to their main focus, which was about maintaining long-term engagement. But they weren't seeing that because people were dropping off relatively quickly. And so I think that's just an interesting way of thinking about evidence, how you set things up, what you're trying to collect, and then ultimately what that means to your customers. So if we move on to the next slide.
Take a pause here. Actually, we've got one more poll for everyone. This is for people on, for the audience members. This is not a tricky one here, don't worry, but we're trying to get a better gauge about people's field of expertise. Might help us determine how best to kind of do our conversation here today. So the poll's launched. Please just take a quick moment to take a look through here and let us know where you currently sit.
And while everyone is voting, that'll provide some useful input to shape, I think, some of the comments and perspective on the rest of the discussion. I'll set things up a little bit. The reason why I think all the great comments that Shrawan just made about thinking holistically about evidence and about who the evidence is for and what kind of evidence matters to those stakeholders is that if you take a step back and look at where we are in the evolution of digital health, there's been enormous progress in technology, obviously. There's massive investment and financing. It's not that challenging these days to raise money. And we've gotten a lot more clarity on regulatory pathways for those solutions and technologies that require some sort of regulatory review or clearance. But where the sector, the industry as a whole is struggling is in commercial success and broad adoption. And there are some really important and fundamental reasons for that. And I think, the most fundamental reason is that digital health comprises a lot of very different things, and very few of those things fit into the existing buckets or categories that all the stakeholders across healthcare, providers, payers, patients, regulators, have and are accustomed to. I'm talking about drugs versus medical devices versus diagnostics versus clinical services. And then within digital health, you have a really wide range of different solutions that have different value propositions and different business models. And so you end up with a very messy situation. It looks like the poll is complete. And we've got over half of the attendees from digital health companies. Looks from the math like people could select more than one, multiple choice. Yep, I'm seeing that. So we've got a few digital therapeutics companies and then a smattering of life sciences, consulting and academic. So we've got a good mix of stakeholders from across the industry. I'm not sure if we have any payers, a couple payers, maybe we get some more payer perspective down the line. But I think it's great to have this mix of attendees because everybody comes to digital health with a different perspective based on what they're accustomed to. And what this means for companies that are thinking about commercializing their solutions, if we go to the next slide, is that there's no set or established business model or set of business models to plug into. I think the easiest point of comparison is to think about traditional drugs. Drug companies know that if you go through the well-established process of preclinical and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, get a regulatory approval, there is a well-established commercial model for getting coverage, for establishing pricing, for prescription and distribution, how to market to clinicians and patients. That's evolving a little bit, but there's not much uncertainty about what happens after you demonstrate the evidence that you need to demonstrate. Digital health couldn't be further from that world. Some digital health solutions can kind of shoehorn themselves into the pathways and models, both from a regulatory perspective and from a commercial perspective, that are already established for clinical services, for medical devices, for drugs and diagnostics. Some don't have that luxury by virtue of what they're actually doing or providing, and have to be a little bit more creative in telling stakeholders across the industry how to look at them, how to cover them, how to use them, how to recommend or prescribe them, and how to get them to patients. And what that leads to is this situation where any company bringing a digital health solution to market has a really complex set of decisions to make about what commercial model to deploy, and who the buyer or buyers are, who the influencer or influencers are that are going to gate adoption, how to reach patients. And the basic way to think about that, obviously at the highest level, is, are you going direct to consumers in kind of a B2C model, whether that's self-pay or maybe with some reimbursement on the back end, or is it more of a B2B2C model? And if it's B2B2C, there's a really wide range of ways to secure payment and ultimately get to end users. There's obviously models that require going through payers, going through employers. Has been very successful for some subsets of digital health. There's partnerships with life sciences companies, and then there's ways to sell directly to providers. And across these different models, every company has to think about that there are different stakeholders to whom you have to demonstrate a value proposition backed up by evidence. And the type of evidence and the level of rigor of that evidence varies really quite a bit depending on what the model is here. And then it's complicated even further by what type of solution is it and what are the claims that you need to bring to market. If it's a general wellness solution that has claims about improving health function in a relatively low risk condition, think about mindfulness for stress, for example. That's a much lower bar for evidence than something that is going to have more clinical or medical claims about modifying a disease or mitigating symptoms, especially in a higher risk indication and or a higher risk patient population. That's going to move more towards probably something that's more regulated with higher level of rigor. Economic evidence is critically important, especially if payers are involved, but also if providers are involved. And so what all this leads to is underlining the importance of having some rough idea of the commercial model or commercial models that you as a company intend to pursue early on in the process, because it has such a fundamental impact on evidence generation and other aspects of the product development process. And my colleague Jeff will elaborate on that further. And then if we can go to the next slide, please.
Okay. And I think to Andrew's point in the last slide, what she was saying is, looking at all those different models, they're also not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? And I think he was alluding to that point that you can do multiple models, you can do multiple models in parallel, multiple models in linear fashion as well. And so, I think that when we look at evidence generation and we look at kind of the spectrum and where digital health falls, these conversations have been going on with the traditional biopharma and medtech world for years. And I remember when I started in that world, having conversations about not just building trials and studies for regulators. And not that wasn't important, it absolutely was. And I saw a comment in there about, payers dictating it. And in that world, which Andrew was saying, where there's a little bit more of a known outcome, you kind of know how the system is set up, who your end user is, who your customer is, and they're not, Shravan and I were talking, that's not the same person. Often in healthcare, the third party payer is a little bit of a wrinkle, or sometimes the health system's paying is a little bit of a wrinkle versus the end user is the patient. And so, I think that when you look at that world, we saw drugs is all the way kind of to one side of it, right? Like we know how that process works. We know that rigor. We know, kind of exactly what to do. If you come up with a novel drug, and then you come up with the second one in that class, you pretty much mimic the first one's studies, and you kind of go from there. All the way to the other side of things is kind of more the software development. I'm talking like non-software, non-healthcare potentially on all the way to the other side, in which you're really working towards potentially an MVP, getting the product out there. It's about user engagement, enjoyment, and so then digital health has to fall somewhere in this spectrum. And I think it's a matter of what we're still looking at as a still a relatively nascent industry that's growing and growing rapidly, is where do our products fall in this spectrum of kind of drugs on one side and really more software and tech on the other. And I think that as you see at the bottom arrow, you can kind of skew one way or the other, and there's advantages to both. But really at the end of the day, I think what determines and what should help drive which path you're going to choose is thinking about what's your end case. And that can change over time, but what is your end case? What is your end use? We can go to the next slide. So again, not the software development expert and not claiming to be, but there are probably product managers and engineers on the call that could school me on this. But I think that in terms of from a healthcare standpoint, looking at the software product development approach, I think that, it's great. And this is one of the things I love about being in digital and having been exposed to this and having gone through this at Achille and having, seen the product development and been a part of that life cycle, is when you look at it, this is where I learned about user story mapping. This is where I learned about user-centered design. How often does that concept come up with a pill or even some med tech innovation? It doesn't always come up. But essentially, you're iterating, you're learning, you're building, you're rapidly changing things, which is great. And you're building towards that kind of MVP, and that's your goal, is to really get it on the market, get it out there. Because if you get use, you get a better product. And that's super critical. You can go to the next slide. And then again, at the other end of it is the drug development cycle, which again has its benefits. One of the things that they've done really well is over the years, they have learned to, kind of go through these steps, which they have to go through. But then also the commercialization phase, because they know who the end users are, you see that they do a really good job of developing, I think, more and more of the phase 3s to accommodate the end user and the stakeholder that they're targeting. So whether it's a buy and bill, whether it's a product that's going to be used at home, whether it's going to be, on the medical benefit, on the pharmacy benefit, and it's still not perfect in that world. And this is an industry that's had years and years to practice and perfect. And I still think it's something that's going to, to probably need to improve over time. But digital is an opportunity to kind of take from the best of both worlds, I think. And so I think, and there's a quick question actually that we'll get to at the very end, actually after the slide about commercial models. And so I think we can go to the next slide. I think as the world is evolving, I think for digital, the opportunity is pick the path that is right for you. So as commercial models are evolving, have your hypothesis of what your commercial model is and what the value you bring to that commercial model is, and target your evidence generation strategy to that commercial model, to that final use case. And again, it's going to change, and I think that that's okay. And I know that the commercial models will evolve too. The advantage of digital versus I think more traditional healthcare interventions is the ability to pivot really quickly. When you see in that previous slide, we talk about kind of the software agile. In digital, we can embrace a little bit of the agile, and then a little bit of, I think, the more traditional biotech, and a little bit more of the med tech traditional approach as well. But I think that in doing so, there are lessons to be learned from both sides. And what I've definitely seen in practice is possibly taking from one side or another. So, Shrawan's poll questions, I have seen those actually in real life, and I've seen them answered actually conversely, where, and I know there's talk here about the CPT codes, where I saw a company really focus on 1 month engagement. That was definitely their focus. And the problem is that they had nothing to do with remote monitoring. They had nothing to do with CPT codes, but they were a chronic use product. So if you're a chronic use product and you have 1 month engagement, that actually, especially with as savvy as end users and payers are becoming, that might not actually be the way that you should go. With drugs, it traditionally is. Because on the drug side, you do your study for a month, you do maybe a phase 4, this is not all, where you say, hey, we'll look at it longitudinally. But for digital, they're kind of looking, well, that's great that you had it for 1 month, but if this is chronic use, how are they gonna use it month 2, month 3, month 4? Because they know with the apps that they use on their phones that's great that they get high traction. Like, listen, gotta admit it, love TikTok. I think it's totally fun. Do I use it every day? No, I don't. And I think people know that the apps that they see and that they use are not something that they use every single day. So when it's healthcare, the big question is, well, I don't know that they take a pill every day. I know they fill it, but that's been accepted that that's the bar that they're getting towards, and they look for secondary outcomes. With digital, they're looking for new outcomes. They're looking for patient engagement, as Shrawan said. They're looking at NPS scores. They're looking at all these different metrics that we never used to have to pay attention to in the biopharma side because they just weren't there. And so really, as you're developing your evidence, know the questions your stakeholders are going to ask. So I think if you look at the screen, and this is where we'll wrap up, and then we'll answer a bunch of questions which we have, which the conversation's awesome. I think that, I think that you have to take into account your stakeholders, and this is me, I'm a very stakeholder approach. So your patients, your clinicians, who's going to pay for it. I think you need to make sure that the value proposition speaks to them. I think you then need to make sure that your trial or your study, what you're doing. So if you're going for regulatory, great. You still need to have something that speaks to your customers. And then at the end of it, the thing that kind of puts it all together is what's the actual business model? How are you engaging with them? Who's paying for it? Who's using it, et cetera. And I'll stop there. So are there some questions that we need to get to from the chat? I think we may have glossed over, or they're going on in the chat.
Yeah, so let's take a pause here. Thanks everyone for this great presentation. The chat is buzzing, which is the sign of a good event. So let's take a second here for our audience members to take a moment to digest further, and then of course to reach out to our participants. We can do it via the chat. Let's take a second, and Shwaran, you had some really great insight that we'd like for you to please bring up live some more in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm just, give me 1 second. I'm just reading through it.
Remind yourself of your greatness. Yeah, so
these
lots of
questions are coming hard and fast. Hey, wrong way of. Oh yes, okay. So I think it was about this point around evidence. So if we take a step back and we think about evidence focusing around those value propositions, that you have all these different value propositions, all of which you as a digital health firm can generate evidence to show that you've created some value. Clinical evidence is one of those things, but there are lots of other value propositions that you can create, and therefore you need to generate evidence to show those values. But there are multiple ways of actually driving evidence generation. And so understanding what your outcome is, understanding what your endpoints are, and thinking about it a little bit like a trial, but actually running it more like a study, knowing what you want your endpoints to be and saying, okay, how is that going to show that we are creating value? And then is that even the right endpoint? I mean, Dime has this incredible resource of hundreds of digital endpoints that pharmaceutical firms can think about when designing new trials. But what we don't see is all the long and hard thinking behind, is this the right endpoint? Is this going to show the value that we want to prove? Yes, they're thinking about it from a regulation point of view, but they're also thinking about it from a competitive point of view and from a marketing point of view. And so their endpoints also need to meet those same aims or help drive those kind of long-term business objectives. And I think as digital health firms, sometimes we often just jump straight in and say, oh, we want to do a trial to show that we improve clinical outcomes. But actually, if your main value proposition is the fact that you drive patients into clinics and get them to see their physicians more often, if you are helping patients to engage with their community and support network in a far more enlightened and better way, and that's the way that you're improving outcomes, yes, you want to show the outcomes, but really the value that you're bringing are the first two value propositions. And so the way you need to think about how you generate the evidence should be focused on those two value propositions and not solely focused on the clinical outcomes that you're showing. The clinical outcomes will come, but showing in a randomized control trial that you generate those clinical outcomes is probably not going to mean that much, even to the chair of a department. As long as you have shown in a study and that your evidence passes muster, that you deliver the outcomes that you're saying you are delivering, that I think is really what's important. And so we get sidetracked and distracted around these other evidence generation concepts.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that additional information. Austin, I have unmuted you. Would you mind being able to ask your question live and give a quick introduction of who you are and your background?
Oh, sure. Hey, my name's Austin Crumpton. I study behavioral economics and patient engagement, and I work as a contractor for a lot of NIH projects and that sort of thing. But my question was related back to that slide that showed the B2C and the all the different types of customer or all the different engagement, sorry, all the different business models that were available. And I was thinking back to the concept of like business model making and business model shaping. And I wonder if, since this is such a new field and we're all trying to do these different things, and there's a lot of status quo of how you're supposed to engage with different customers and who's supposed to pay for what, if we're not somehow interacting with these different customers and shaping what the new business models will be. Because as I see that slide, it was kind of like a snapshot in time of the current models that are in use. But I wonder how those different models are going to be evolving and how we can actually shape those models in the future so that we can generate, different streams of revenue that might not exist yet. And I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on how we could, do that shaping and how things might be evolving in the future.
Thanks, Austin. I'm happy to take first stab at that. So that kind of complex rainbow slide, which I know can cause a headache, it shows how complex and how many options there are today. And it's probably not exhaustive. You could probably come up with some permutations of those models. And it also, of course, doesn't show the trends. And there are trends across those models in terms of how companies strategically are approaching them. That we can talk about. And then there's the additional question you raised of, well, are there entirely new models that aren't even reflected there yet, which I can get to in a second. But just in terms of the trends, there's a couple important points to highlight. One is that a lot of digital health companies, I think especially those that have been at it for a while, have figured out that they need to pursue several of those models in parallel or in sequence. Sometimes that's an accident, sometimes it's deliberate, but a pretty common experience that I'm sure you've seen, and Rock Health's had some good data on this, is a bunch of companies that start by thinking they'll be direct to consumer. They've got Silicon Valley investors. They like the idea of the rapid scaling and margins of a consumer-facing tech company, and then realize that the demand isn't there and have to pivot to going B2B, whether that means selling to employers or selling to payers. There are a lot of companies that have kind of accidentally gone through that transition. There are others who have done that deliberately, realizing that there might be a small segment of consumers that are willing to pay out of pocket, and that's not a big enough market to be the end game, but it's a good enough early market to get feedback on the product, to refine the product, and to collect early data that will be needed to appeal to stakeholders for more of a B2B2C business model or business models down the line. I think that's an important trend, and there's good examples now that companies can learn from there. Another important trend is, although this one may be reversing, as I'll talk about in a second, is a lot of companies have run into a wall trying to sell to providers. Selling digital technologies to providers, I think over the last 7-8 years has proven much harder than a lot of companies in the industry had hoped. And the reality is, and this gets back to Sharon's point about evidence and value proposition that matters, if you go to providers with a really strong story on clinical evidence, that's almost never enough to actually get them on board, especially if it's something that it's going to require them to do something, recommend it to patients, educate patients, deal with questions, or even worse from their perspective, review data, do some intervention in the case of, for example, a monitoring tool. In our experience, there's only rare instances to date where providers are willing to pay for and adopt digital health, and the value propositions that resonate with them are enable my practice to bill more, so incremental revenue, or deliver a major improvement in workflow efficiency, take headaches off of me and my staff, or both. There might eventually be a third, which is force me to use these because these are embedded in clinical guidelines, and that's an aspiration, but we're not there yet. That's one example of new models. Another one is, and there's been some comments in the chats about this, is the Medicare and increasingly commercial reimbursement codes for remote patient monitoring and chronic care management are potentially opening an avenue toward that first value proposition for providers, which is actually enabling them to use these tools to bill incremental revenue, especially if you stack those codes in a meaningful enough way to drive adoption. So that's an example of how the models on those slides could become more viable. As far as totally new models, there's plenty of room for creativity. I think some of the things that need to happen for really new models to come about is for regulators and/or payers to actually create different categories. For example, digital therapeutics, do those eventually get a separate regulatory pathway, a separate way of actually being covered and paid for, or do they still fit into, in the regulatory case, medical device via SAMD, and in the payer case, either the pharmacy benefit or the medical benefit? If the stakeholders can kind of change their infrastructure, I think that can open some interesting new models.
Great.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great question, Austin. Thanks. So we're going to jump over to another awesome question from Tony Simon. Tony, I have just unmuted you. Are you able to ask your question live?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Oh, there I see my picture. So that gives it away. So I'm CEO of Cognivive. We're building neurotherapeutics, which we're delivering in virtual reality. And we've been trying to raise a seed round for a solid 10 months now. And the thing is that having engaged a very long reimbursement process with a top-notch strategist and all the other things, we're following the pathways that everybody suggests. The investors, almost all of the investors, cannot get past this one point of, okay, what evidence do you have that this really works? And what they mean, even if they don't understand it, is essentially RCT evidence. And, it's very hard to push back and say, well, the rest of the space is doing it this way, and these are the engagement aspects and those kind of things. So it's become a really hard problem. A bunch of people have lined up on the side. No one really seems to be willing to lead, and it always seems to come down to evidence. So I agree with everything everybody's been saying, but this is actually a make or break issue for a lot of smaller companies like ours.
Yeah, and I think that it is, there definitely are external constraints in it. Like as I was mentioning in kind of the drug space too, if one drug comes out with a trial design and the FDA accepts it, that tends to be kind of the standard that a lot of other follow-on products will use. And so if you're in a space, not that your product isn't unique, I think where like the bar has been set and this is what's been done, sometimes it can be difficult to get around that. That being said, I can understand that people want proof that the product works. And I think that is something. As we look at like the stages of like med device, we're looking at like feasibility, proof of concept, pilot, and kind of those different phases of development. I think that in some cases, especially if you're going for reimbursement and you're going down that path, again, having talked to a lot of payers, they still are used to seeing, and that's part of that stakeholder, like they're used to seeing that RCT level data. That doesn't mean that it has to be the most rigorous clinical trial, but that is definitely something that they are used to seeing. And but that in itself too, the kind of the crux of it is that's also not necessarily sufficient for them either, because we are a new type of product, and they are also going to look to be like, okay, well, what is your engagement? And payers are playing a different role now in digital, where I actually see kind of to the last comment from Austin, payers are starting to me in some ways to turn into provider lights. In a way where payers are starting to say, look at like the digital health formularies. We can tell by our data maybe who's a good candidate for these digital health products, and they're going to be the one that's going to be guiding a member towards those options or towards the digital health company. And so essentially, they're kind of playing this quasi role of provider, almost not regulator, but kind of, and they're going to look at the evidence in that way. And so, yeah, there is sometimes a higher bar in those fields. And I can see that if you're going down that path, that is something that's going to be kind of thrust upon you in a way.
If I can do a quick just follow-up comment. So I totally agree with everything you said about payers. The thing I'm trying to get across is that investors, we need money to get data and data to get money.
Yeah.
They have a naive position, right? They just think, oh, well, this is medical, so you need those kinds of data. And my question is really more about how to educate the investors that, they're trying to de-risk everything. There's always a less risky company when it comes to therapeutics. And so it's very hard to follow what everyone's discussing here and satisfy them at the same time. And it's just become a very big challenge.
So I can at least have a vague answer to this. Having been in this situation myself and helped plenty of firms in exactly the same situation, and take, I think, what I'm about to say with a little bit of a grain of salt, because it's commercial information and the way to think about it commercially, as opposed to, I think, if you wanted to do things by the book. So maybe it's a little controversial. But one of the points I made was this difference between trial and study. And as you said, as you alluded to yourself, the investors themselves may not even recognize exactly what they're asking. They want to see evidence. They don't really have a good understanding of the different types of evidence. And evidence generation is like an onion. You have lots of different layers, and you can design trials to develop greater and greater confidence in the evidence that you're showing. You can have bigger participants. You know, at med school, we're taught to go through a critically appraise a paper. Was the participant size big enough? Was the sample size big enough? Have they used the right statistical tests? Investors are not going to go through that whole process, right? And so I think you need to then think about it more around kind of gaming the system a little, that you don't have to go through a randomized controlled trial to generate the evidence that they might be looking for. You have to, I think, put yourself in their shoes and say, what are they looking for? What values do they want to see? What check boxes do they want to see to show that you are on the right path? And especially if your product is going to require regulatory clearance at some point, then you do need to be showing that you're on the path to heading in that direction. So one thing I would keep in mind and think about is the burden of proof for abstracts and conference presentations is actually much lower than it is for peer-reviewed journals. Our gold standard is to put together something that we can submit to a peer-reviewed journal. But actually, a lot of small pieces of trials and small pieces of studies can be written into abstracts and presented at Connected Health Conference or to Digestive Disease Week if you're in the GI space, or wherever it might be. And some of those journals do actually publish appendices to their actual journal. And so you have a PDF that you can throw in front of an investor and say, here is my abstract printed in the appendix of the Journal of Gastroenterology or the Journal of Cardiology, right? And it becomes this, you aren't trying to fool anyone, but you have to be quite upfront and say that, you know, we are doing everything we can. We have only a limited amount of money. We need to show that we're on the right path to doing RTCs, and we have to do that to actually get this product to market. But here is some evidence to show that we have some clinical outcomes. Here is some evidence to show that we have some patient engagement. And that will most likely check a lot of the boxes that the investors are looking for, because they often don't always know exactly what they're looking for.
And Shravan, just to follow up on that, I've also seen some smaller companies engage with their potential end stakeholders very, very early on, being very transparent with where they are, generating data that way. And not only do you then have the data to kind of Shravan's point, but then you also have like an actual customer that's used the product as well. And obviously that depends on the space that you're in. But to Shravan's point, I think that what do the investors want to see?
I really like all of that, especially Jeff, your comment at the end about engaging with end users early. This is yet another plug to perhaps do patient engagement as early as possible, as often as possible. Thanks for those great questions. Let's see here. Let's move to the next one. Let's see. Cheryl, you had a great question earlier. Would you be able to introduce yourself and ask it live?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Sure can. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you to all the panelists. You know, I've been a member of DIME from the very beginning and involved in some of the publications, and it's just wonderful to see how everything is evolving, and I've learned so much. So thank you really. My question, I wear actually two hats today. So I'm in a large pharmaceutical company as in medical affairs, a senior medical director, and I also have a startup initiative of my own that includes digital health elements. So I'm sort of asking, this question actually that I'm asking today is coming from more from the pharma, the big pharma that's, I'm always trying to bring digital health to, you know, the forefront of what we're doing in clinical development and medical affairs. And I really appreciate the comments that, you know, maybe the burden of proof is less and we can game the system and be very creative in how we create data, et cetera, and that I completely get. However, the acceptance by our standard stakeholders in pharma is so unclear, and to leaders, more let's say conservative leadership, if I may use that word, and I feel that we as a community in digital health, and DIME is really playing a wonderful role in leading a lot of this. How can we as an organization encourage those stakeholders to be more transparent and more clear to this evolving digital health community? How can we put more, additional burden on them without, making it too strict? We do want to keep that ability to be flexible, but we do need them to state what they need and why, so that we have some parameters to work around or within as we are, quote unquote, gaming the system.
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, Dime has done, like, when you look at like the playbook and you look at I mean, there's a lot of companies that focus on decentralized trials that are part of Dime. Our parent company does as well, Parcel. I think that, it's definitely something that, at least for me, and I don't know about for you, Cheryl, I've seen that evolve over the last few years in conversations that I've had with biopharma. I think one thing is there's people such as yourself and biopharma is building out digital health or digital therapeutic organizations within it. A lot of the, SLB has had experience with pharma and med tech as well. I think that one of the things that, and again, just being very commercially focused, I think one of the biggest proof points that's helped as well is also there are success stories now, and there are companies that are doing it that can help kind of illustrate, here's the type of data you need. I can tell you that the conversations, when you look at like a conservative population, I definitely see health insurers, payers, PBMs, a lot of the employers I talk to, they can sometimes be conservative. And I think that over time, they've educated themselves, and some of it's been just exposure, for sure, about understanding, what is appropriate in this space, because it is a little bit different. And I think that having some success stories has really helped pivot. One of the ones I love to highlight is like Big Health, not necessarily a plug for their product. Like if you look at like somebody that really started out on focusing on real world evidence and generation, less so regulatory, it was that company. And there's many more and more and more now. And that being said, though, I don't know that you can necessarily, it is a shift. It is moving things, piece by piece, bit by bit, towards kind of accepting those different endpoints and then having the proof points from the real world that those are actually important and relevant. And again, I think a great transition to that is sometimes actually doing some med device case studies as well. That's something that I've used in the past in terms of evidence generation and commercialization models, because a lot of digital health and digital therapeutics, if they're going for regulatory, it is following that path.
So your question actually reminds me a little bit of, so you may know a gentleman called, I'm going to mangle his surname, Eugene Borkovich. He has he's in the middle of writing, he was at Bayer, I think. He has a weekly email that he sends out because he's writing a book about his journey through Bayer, trying to build interest, knowledge, understanding of digital health and other innovations within a big pharmaceutical firm. And so your question actually reminds me a little bit of a lot of the comments that he often writes about in those emails. I think from what I've seen is that trying to get, actually, let me take a step back. So the last 2, maybe 3 years, I've been giving digital health presentations at pharma conferences focused on med affairs teams. And med affairs teams, you'd think, would actually be quite distant from a lot of the things that are happening within the digital health world. And part of my presentation has always been that actually I think med affairs teams should be right at the table at pharmaceutical firms when thinking about how digital health tools are going to interface with pharmaceutical firms. And I remember the first year that I gave the presentation, and I think people thought, okay, this is interesting, but I think we're actually more interested in the next speaker, who was, one of the top CEOs and very well known. But over the last 2 or 3 years, actually the interest has become greater and greater. And I mean, and last year the session was extended to just give a bigger bunch of time to questions, because in the second year, the questions kind of just continued and continued. And I've seen that over the last couple of years where there has been growing interest. If I look at the number of people that are being hired into kind of digital health teams within pharmaceutical firms, that has been growing. If I think about the number of executives within pharmaceutical firms that are talking about digital health and actively answering questions in an informed way about how they're thinking about these things, I think that's really important, because driving innovation within a big institution often does have to come from the top down. And so I'm definitely seeing a lot of these things happening. And so I think trying to get firms to continue down that road, I think it's very difficult at a kind of a mid-senior level to actually drive a lot of those things, but you can at least help them along by, as Jeff said, educating, talking about use cases, talking about different types of evidence, and if there's a thought around how a product could interface with what a particular team's doing or thinking, having a conversation around, okay, well, what kind of evidence would we be okay with? What kind of evidence would we look for from a potential partner? And then actually starting to have that conversation with the whole of the team to head in the right direction. I hope that kind of answered the question.
Thanks, everyone. Great question, Cheryl. Great question, everyone else. There's lots of questions still rolling in on the chat and the Q&A. And so we encourage everyone to bring any more questions to Dime's Slack. Our panelists are fantastic and are on Slack. So feel free to tag them. I'm apologizing in advance to our presenters to address those and throw them out there. And so here we can see our next event coming up, which is our journal club. We have here in an Ask Me Anything style where we'll be talking about the physician survey analysis. And so this is about the telehealth impact survey, where clinicians on the front line of COVID-19 have been surveyed about what was needed and how telehealth did or how it can enhance care in the future. And so this survey is to give advice to healthcare. That's regulators, that's payers, that's clinicians about how to move forward into the new normal. So our next slide here is about our next webinar to occur in January, which will be discussing diversity amongst digital health startup companies, presented by Rock Health in their great annual report on diversity. All right, next slide here, and hopefully we can get everyone out right on time. Thank you everyone for participating live, asking your questions, and especially to Shmorin, Jeff, and Andrew for your excellent presentation and insights. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks all.